The portion of Beshalach has 116 psukim, and the siman for the Parsha is Yad Emunah, the hand of faith, and sneh, or perhaps the word sneh. And so the question comes to mind, why is it that the mnemonic for the portion of Beshalach is the hand of faith? What is the connection with this and the Parsha? But in truth, if you look into the Parsha at the very end, you have already an answer. The Torah tells us that God tells Moshe Rabbeinu to wage war against Amalek. And the Torah says when he has his hands up in the air, the Jews are victorious. When his hands go down, the Jews are losing the war. And it says that the hands of Moshe were very heavy. And so Aaron and Hur go up to the mountain and they put a rock underneath Moshe to sit down, and they hold up his hands. And so he's able to conquer the nation of Amalek. And here we find in chapter number 17, in verse number 12, it says, Vayihi yadav emunah, and his hands were emunah. And similarly, the mnemonic, instead of saying yadav emunah, his hands were with faith, it says the word yad emunah, the hand of faith. And this is the same mnemonic, or the same gematria, the same numerical computation as 116, the amount of verses in the Parsha. What is the concept of emunah? What does emunah mean? What does it mean that the hands of Moses was emunah, was faithful? We find numerous interpretations to the word emunah. And to start with Rashi, Rashi says that the word emunah here means faithful prayer, that his hands were opened and spread apart to the heavens. Bitfila ne'emana unochoina. It was a faithful prayer and a proper prayer. And when he was praying to God, the Jews were victorious. And that is the meaning of yadav emunah, or yad emunah, hands of faith, through prayer, and a faithful prayer that God will answer his prayers. The Rashbam says that the word emunah here means strength, that he held his hands up b'choiskon, with tremendous energy and strength. That is the meaning of emunah. The Ibn Ezra says that the word emunah comes from the passage in the Megillah. There in the Megillah we find that Mordechai raised Esther. It says, Vayihi oimein es Hadassah. He raised Hadassah, which was Esther. So the word oimein are the same letters as emunah, and therefore it means that Moses raised up his hands. That is the meaning of yad emunah, that his hands were raised up and therefore they were victorious. Similarly, the Ramban Nachmanides says on the word emunah that it means height. He raised up his hands high into the sky. And then he goes on to say that this is the secret to the priestly blessings, that the Kohanim raise up their hands high and they bless the Jewish people, because Yadav, his hands, alludes to the 10 fingers on the hands. And through the Kohen blessing the Jewish people with the 10 fingers, they are actually accessing the 10 attributes of God upon the Jewish people. The Baal HaTurim goes on to say that this passage of emunah ad boya shemesh, that his hands were raised high until the sun set, alludes to the fact that Moses rested upon the merits of the forefathers, of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. He goes on to say that the merit of Avraham was faith, the merit of Yitzchak was to come, And the merit of Jacob was the fact that he lied down on the mountain when the sun set. And therefore the Torah implies these three words, emunah ad boy hashemesh, to imply that he rested upon or he relied upon the merits of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But there's also another concept of emunah in this week's parsha. And that is earlier in the portion, after the famous miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea. It says over there that Vayaminu b'Hashem uveMoshe avdoi, that the Jews believed in God and in Moses, his servant. And as the Even Ezra points out over here, that Shehu emes, that God is true, and they believed in Moses, Shehu avdoi, that he is God's servant, and v'lo yaseh rak ma sheyitzuvanu, and he only does what God commands Moshe Rabbeinu to do. The Mechilta goes on to say that believing in the shepherd, which is Moses, is the same as having faith in God. And we know that in many, many circumstances, it is the shepherds of God, the leaders of the Jewish people, the Moses of the generation, that brings the generation to acknowledge and understand and to truly strengthen their emunah, their faith in Almighty God. The Zohar goes on to say that Ihu emes v'ihi emunah, that the word emunah, faith, is actually the same as emet, which is truth. But emunah, faith, is from the distance. And emes, truth, is up close. In other words, that a person has faith from the distance that that which he believes in is true. So he knows that it's true, but he doesn't really understand it. So that's called faith. And the Rebbe goes on to say that even though emunah is the introduction to truth, however, that is the beginning stage of a person's service to God. Every Jew starts with the foundation of emunah. The Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that the word emunah, faith, comes from the word craftsman, or a craft. What is a craft? Like a woodmaker or a cabinet maker. That it's a craft. The more you work on it, the better you get. I had a child who I met today who was becoming bar mitzvah, and he tells me, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. I asked his mother, what does it mean he doesn't believe in God? She says, I don't know, he goes to Hebrew school, but he says he doesn't believe in God. So I asked the boy, tell me, do you know the story of the Exodus? He tells me no. Do you know the story of the splitting of the Red Sea? He says no. He says, do you know the fact that 3 million Jews witnessed God at Sinai? It's a scientific fact. And as the Rebbe told my grandfather, Rabbi Jacob J. Hechel, blessed memory, that 1,000 theories cannot change one fact. It's a scientific fact based on epistemology, based on the fact that there was 3 million Jews that witnessed this occasion of God appearing on Sinai. So how can you deny God? I said to him, my son, you don't deny God, you're simply an ignoramus. You have to go and study. Read the Bible, and I gave him a bunch of books that he should read about pertaining to science and Torah. But the idea of emunah is the more you do, the more you practice, the more you put on tefillin, the more you study Torah, the more you give tzedakah, the more you pray, the more you do the mitzvahs, the more you do it and you get into the routine, the more you begin to believe, and your emunah becomes stronger and stronger. So that is the meaning of emunah, to be a craft. And I think it's important to also note that emunah, as we said a moment ago, is only the very beginning of a person's relationship with God. Emunah is the first step, but from emunah, one rises to the level of bitachon, or bitachin, which means trust. What is the difference between emunah and trust? Here the Rebbe has a talk on the portion of Shemois where he expounds on this in Likutei Sichos. And he says that emunah, faith, means that you know and you believe everything is from God, for good or for bad. And therefore, God forbid, chas v'shalom, if things don't work out exactly the way you want, by having emunah, by having faith, it's easier to swallow, it's easier to accept. Because you know there must be a good reason behind it. If God is doing it, God does not do anything for bad. There's no bad that comes down from heaven. There has to be a good reason for it. Perhaps we don't see it, perhaps we don't know, but ultimately it has to be for the good, and it's from God. That's emunah. That's faith. Bitachon, trust, means I trust it's going to be good. Just like on the dollar bill it says, in God we trust. And when you put that dollar bill on the counter and you buy a cup of coffee, you trust that there is gold that is backing that dollar, that dollar is not a rubber check, but that dollar is going to go through. In God we trust. Trust means I know it's going to be good. Even though all odds are against me. Even though nature says it can never happen. Even though I don't deserve it. But I trust in Hashem, I trust in God, I have complete bitachon. And bitachon is not simply a cop-out, okay, God can do it. No, you have to struggle with it. That you understand the pros and the cons, and you see the negative implications. And yet, you work on yourself and you say, I trust in Hashem. That is the vessel for God's blessing. The famous quote of the Baal Shem Tov, Trach gut wird sein gut. Think positive and it will be positive. The moment we begin to think positive, that changes the whole scenario. That is the paradigm shift, to thinking positive. So from emunah, we have to move on to bitachon. We have to move on to trust. So therefore the Torah tells us in this week's Parsha that it was a paradigm shift for the Jewish people because they began to believe in God. They began to truly believe in Moses, God's servant, after the splitting of the Red Sea. Because when they left Egypt, they were concerned that the army is still there, and any time the army can chase them and bring them back. But once they saw the splitting of the Red Sea, and they saw the entire army of Pharaoh and Egypt go into the Red Sea, and then the sea actually threw out all the bodies of the dead soldiers. Now they knew that they were truly free. Vayaminu ba'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdei. They truly had faith in God and Moses, his servant. And this brings us to the second siman, the second mnemonic from the Masoretic text here, which even though the word sneh is found in the Torah, it's found in the book of Ezra, chapter 2, verse 35, b'nei sneh, but I believe here that the Masoretic text is actually alluding to the story of the sneh. And as I said earlier, that Rashi explains many times the Torah omits the letter Aleph in the word to shorten the word. But the word sneh is the famous story of Moses and the fiery thorn bush, which is called the sneh. We know that when Moses was a shepherd for his father-in-law Yisro, and one day he was in the desert and he saw on a mountain a burning bush. This mountain was actually Mount Sinai. This was the mountain that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people on after they left the land of Egypt. And it was on this mountain that God tells Moses, go and tell the Jewish people, I have remembered them and I am going to take them out of Egypt. What does Moses say to God? Vayan Moshe vayomer. Moses responds to God and he says, Vehem lo yaminu li, they will not believe in me. That's what he says. And in that portion, in that chapter, you find the word yaminu 4 times. For God tries to encourage Moshe and to persuade Moshe, don't worry, go back, they will believe in you. So here we see that the entire question of faith began already earlier by the burning bush, by the sneh. It was only in this week's Parsha, so we have Shemois, Ve'era, Boy, Beshalach. 4 weeks later, or 3 portions after, that finally the Torah says, Vayaminu ba'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdoi, that they finally believed in Moses. The Jewish people are very skeptical. We are a nation of skeptics. Even after miracles and even after all the proofs, we still want to know where's the beef. Until we see the Jews actually taken out of Egypt, promises are good, but we want to see the actual fulfillment of these promises. Finally, Vayaminu ba'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdoi. So here the Torah reminds us that this question of faith already began earlier, and so the mnemonic is the word sneh, to tell us that it began already by the firing bush, burning bush. However, it ended off over here in this week's Parsha. It's interesting to note that the word sneh, which means a thorn bush, is very similar to the word Sinai. Because our sages tell us the reason that the mountain upon which the Torah was given is called Sinai. Why? Because the word Sinai is from the word sneh. Sneh means hatred. Once God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, hatred began to spread amongst the nations of the world. Why? Because they were jealous. Why did God choose the Jews? Why did God give the Jews the Torah? As we say every day in the morning prayers, Ata b'chatanu mikol ha'amim. We say every day in the bracha of Asher b'charbanim b'kol ha'amim, and the bracha of the Torah, that you, God, chose us from all the nations of the world, and Baruch Atah Hashem, no saying Torah, you gave us the Torah. And this is a famous prayer that we say on major holidays, Ata b'chatanu mikol ha'amim. You have chosen us from all the nations of the world. And this brought about the sinah. This brought about the hatred of the nations of the world, which we call today anti-Semitism. So this is the word sneh and the word Sinai. And ultimately from this sneh, from the Sinai, came about the greatest bitachon, came about the greatest faith and trust in God. And God said, you're going to see that I will truly take you out of Egypt, and the first exile and the ultimate exile with the coming of Mashiach very soon, speedily in our days. So we talk about the concept of faith. We talk about the concept of emunah, and especially the idea of Vayaminu ba'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdoi, the faith not only in God, but in the servants of God, who do the will of God, and are truly a faithful shepherd that have no desire of their own, but simply to fulfill God's will and to be a funnel and a channel of God's blessings to the world. I would like to therefore tell a story of a woman by the name of Rhoda Friedland, who lives today in Muncie, and she was married in 1947. In 1947 she was married, and for the first 3 years of her marriage she had no children. And she went to my grandfather, Rabbi Jacob J. Hecht, and she said, I want to go to the Rebbe for a bracha. And so she went with my grandfather, Rabbi Jacob J. Hecht, to the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. It was a Thursday night right before he passed away. He passed away on the Shabbos. She claims it was the last Yechidus, it was the last private audience of someone going to visit the Rebbe. And my grandfather went over to the Rebbe and said that the doctors say that she won't have any children. And the Rebbe said again, did she go to the doctors? Did she go to doctors? And my grandfather said, yes, she went to doctors, and they said that she will not have any children. So Mrs. Friedland said that the Rebbe laughed. He laughed. And he said, they'll have children, and they'll have healthy children. That Shabbos, the previous Rebbe passed away. And a year later, the Rebbe became Rebbe. So she went to the Rebbe, and she told the Rebbe that, the previous Rebbe gave me a bracha to have children. But in the interim, I don't have any children. And doctors are telling me to operate because I get sick from time to time. And if I operate, there's no way I can have any children. What should I do? So the Rebbe said, if my father-in-law told you you're going to have children, you're going to have children. And therefore you are not to operate. Okay? In the meantime, she got sick again. And she went to another doctor. And again the doctor said, you have to operate. So she came to the Rebbe, what should I do? The Rebbe said, look, go to my wife's doctor. So she goes to the Rebbitzins doctor, and the Rebbitzins doctor checks her out, gives her a checkup, and says, lady, you must operate immediately. There's no second opinion, there's no other choice, you have to go right now and operate. She comes back to the Rebbe. She says, the Rebbe, I went to your wife's doctor, and she also tells me I have to operate. And as she's in the Rebbe's room, the phone rings. In the early days, the Rebbe would pick up his own phone, and it was the Rebbe's wife's doctor on the phone. And she said to the Rebbe, you must tell this woman to operate. If not, you're going to kill her. She must operate. And the Rebbe said, thank you, and hung up the phone. And then the Rebbe smiled and said, go to another doctor. She went to another doctor, a big professor. He again gave her a checkup and said, look, I am checking you in right now to Mount Sinai Hospital for 2 weeks. We're going to operate, and you're going to get rid of this once and for all because it's very, very dangerous. So she came back to the Rebbe. Rebbe, I want to thank you for all your help and your support and your encouragement, but I've decided to do the operation. So the Rebbe said to her, do me one more favor. Can you do me a favor? She says, yeah, I can do you a favor, of course. Rebbe, what kind of favor could I do for you? Go to one more doctor. Rebbe, okay, if you want me to go to one more doctor, I'll go. And she admits, in those days she did not understand, the real power and the real holiness of a tzaddik, of a Rebbe. That when the Rebbe says something, it's real. So she went to one last doctor, a big, big doctor. She had a cousin that had a baby, so therefore she went to her doctor. And the doctor begins to examine her and says, yeah, I can see why the other doctors are telling you to have an operation. But you know what? You should go home right now and get into bed because it looks like you're pregnant. The woman went home. She got into bed and she called back to the Rebbe's office and spoke to the Rebbe that the doctor says I should go home and get into bed because it could be that I'm pregnant. And the Rebbe said, good. And Baruch Hashem, she had her first son, and then she had another 2 children who were all healthy and good and vibrant, and the Baruch Hashem are truly a bundle of nachas to her and to her husband. So this is the concept of Vayaminu b'Hashem of Moshe Avdoi, the concept of believing in God and to believe in God's shepherds and God's servants, in the Moshe Rabbeinu, the leaders of every generation. And we hope and pray that with the prayers of Moses, who continues to pray on behalf of the Jewish people, and with the prayers and the merit of Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, we will truly have our emunah, we will strengthen our faith, as the Rebbe has told us that we will see in this generation the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, and so we hope and pray to see very soon already the coming of Mashiach this week and today and now, and God himself will take us out of this galus and teach us Torah with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mheira b'imenu. Amen.